Good evening. Welcome to this Lou Douglas lecture on public issues. I'm Linda Tiener. I'm the Executive Director at UFM Community Learning Center, who's the sponsor of this lecture series. Our lecture series is named for Lou Douglas, who was a distinguished professor of political science at Kansas State University. During Lou's tenure at the university, he was widely known for inspiring students, faculty, and the community at large to instigate change and to motivate grassroots organizations and individuals to pursue social justice in politics, economics, and foreign policy. Our lecture series honors him and has for the past 30-plus years, and we're very excited to be able to do that. Our lecture tonight is going to be about middle class and the changes that have happened in that economically through the years. We ask that as you listen to this, you think about questions that you might have for our lecturer. And at the end of the session, we will have a free-flowing question and answer period. We ask that you come to the microphones to ask your questions so everyone can hear. We also ask that you stay for the question and answers because sometimes that's the most interesting part of the whole lecture is the dialogue that happens between the speaker and our students and faculty. So please stay and participate in that. If you have to leave, please do so very quietly so others are not disturbed and can hear the questions and the answers. I want to thank Provost April Mason, the Distinguished Academic Excellence Fund, and the Student Governing Association for their assistance in helping make this lecture possible tonight through their funding of our speaker. Now what I'd like to do is introduce Lloyd Thomas. He's a professor of economics here at K-State, and he's going to do the introduction of our speaker. Lloyd?
Well, thank you for coming to this lecture tonight. I want to just say a few words about Lou Douglas. He was an esteemed professor of political science at K-State from the late 40s through the late 70s. Many of you did not know him. He was a progressive thinker and a highly principled individual who tended to arrange his sympathies with the underdog. He strongly believed in the role of public education in lifting the life possibilities of those born into families of humble financial means. He would be disappointed in the tuition increases that American universities have imposed on students in the last 10 years. He passionately opposed developments and policies that he perceived to be detrimental to the vitality of our democracy. It is fair to say that Lou Douglas would be disappointed by recent developments in Washington, D.C. Let me correct that. He would be outraged by what's happening with the dysfunction in our government. And he would be outraged by state legislatures that impose savage cuts in funding for elementary and secondary education while eliminating income taxes on many of our most highly paid individuals in the state. Many states are doing this. Each year, the Lou Douglas Lecture Committee considers contemporary issues that are, quote, in the spirit of Lou Douglas. There was unanimous agreement among committee members this year that rising inequality of income and wealth are among the most paramount issues facing the nation. You've seen the statistics. 90% of the equity owned in the stock market is owned by the wealthiest 10% of Americans. Joe Stiglitz, an economist, estimated that in 2010, the first year of our full recovery from the 2007 to 2009 recession, 93% of the increase in the nation's income went to the top 1% of the income distribution. CEOs of top American corporations, which used to earn 30 times what the average employee of the corporation earned, are now earning 500 times the average employee. If you can stand one or two more, the share of the nation's income going to the top 10% in the income distribution has increased from about 33% in 1980 to 51% last year in 2012. And more bothersome than that probably is the share going to the top 1% has increased from about 9% in 1980 to 22% today. Meanwhile, the median real income of U.S. workers adjusted for inflation is lower today than it was in 1996, some 17 years ago. So we're very fortunate tonight to have with us Edward Wolff, an economics professor at New York University and one of the nation's foremost scholars working in the area of income and wealth distribution and also in poverty. Professor Wolff did his undergraduate work at Harvard and earned his PhD at Yale. He's authored more than 10 books, including several published by such prestigious publishers as Oxford University Press, Cambridge University Press, MIT Press. He has a prolific publication record. I count some 200 journal articles, including several in the economics profession's top journals. He has served as managing editor of the Review of Income and Wealth for more than 20 years, as well as associate editor for numerous economics journals, including the Journal of Economic Inequality. He has served as a consultant for many organizations, Committee for Economic Development, Institute for Social Research, Institute for Research on Poverty, Center for Economic Research at Tilburg University in the Netherlands, American Council for Capital Formation, and the Economic Policy Institute. He's received research grants from, among others, National Science Foundation, Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, the Ford Foundation, Russell Sage Foundation, Ewing Marion Kauffman Foundation, Upjohn Institute for Employment Research, and many others. Enough said. The title of his talk tonight is Rising Profitability and the Middle Class Squeeze. Would you please welcome Professor Edward Wolff.
Well, thank you. It's really a great pleasure to be here. As well as a great honor to be here. This is, I think, an excellent lecture series, great tradition, and I hope I can do it justice with my talk. My talk is kind of a sad one, I think, a disturbing one maybe even an outrageous one. And as we'll see as I go through some of my pictures, mainly a picture talk, I think you'll see that things have not been good in the United States. First of all, okay, I'm from the Big Apple. It's a pleasure to be in the Little Apple. Okay, who said this? There's class warfare, all right, but it's my class, the rich class, that's making war, and we're winning. Do you know who said that? No one knows. All right, well, you might be surprised, none other than Warren Buffett. Okay, back in January of 2010. Who said this? Well, maybe not too surprising for those of you who sometimes read the New York Times. For extreme inequality is still on the rise, and it's poisoning our society. Well, you know, Krugman said that. And what did he mean by that? It's poisoning our society. And, you know, there are lots of detrimental effects from rising inequality. It's not just that inequality is bad, though many people think that. I mean, I certainly feel that a just society is one with equal distribution of income. But there are lots of ramifications to rising or a high level of inequality. Health, for example. The rich do live longer. Okay. And the gap in life expectancy between the rich and even the middle class has been rising 4 or 5 years now. I mean, that's a lot. Happiness. Well, turns out that more equal societies are actually happier. There's a lot of research on happiness, and they ask people questions about that. Health. It's not just life expectancy. More equal societies are healthier. Mental health. Well, it turns out that economic insecurity is a major source of mental illness. If you have an equal society, a just society, guess what? Mental illness is much less. Trust. Turns out that more equal societies, people have greater trust, not only in their government, okay, but also in their fellow man. So there are lots of ramifications. Another surprising one is social and economic mobility. A lot of people think that, well, we're an unequal country, as we'll see, but we're also a very mobile country. So it doesn't so much matter what the level of inequality is as long as it evens out over the lifetime. Or it's okay because you can be born to poor parents and become rich. Well, that's not the case. Turns out that more unequal societies also have lower economic mobility. We have much lower intergenerational mobility than European countries like France and Germany, and much lower than places like Sweden, Finland, and even Canada. So it's not the case that high mobility offsets high inequality. In fact, it's just the opposite. High inequality begets high inequality. Children of the rich do much better than children of the poor. So this is a self-perpetuating phenomenon. So these things are social ramifications beyond the simple fact that inequality itself may be bad. Okay, so the story I'm going to tell you starts with this now somewhat famous diagram. You'll see I will update this soon, but this appeared several years ago, and it represents sort of the history of inequality in this society. This shows the share of income of the top 10%. Very striking pattern. It was very high during the 1920s. In fact, 1929 was a peak year in terms of inequality. The share of the top 10% reached almost 50%. And then we had a period of lessening inequality during the 1930s into the 1940s. And it kind of plateaued out. It stayed low, fluctuated a bit, until maybe, well, in this diagram, in this analysis, maybe the early, mid-1970s. And then you can see it taking off. It really starts to take off. And inequality climbs and climbs. 2007, back to where it was in 1929, before the start of the Great Recession. And today, the latest figures from these two economists, Piketty and Saiz, show that the share of the top 10% has reached an all-time high. So inequality has continued to rise. Family income. Well, the bottom graph shows the income of the average family in the United States. Median family income, we call it. And everything is adjusted for inflation. So these are real incomes. So again, you can see that for a while, incomes were really rising in this country. In fact, from 1947 to 1973, median family income actually doubled. So we used to have a society where incomes were growing almost every year, and people were better off year after year. In fact, if we go further back in time, Incomes have been growing from maybe 1750. There is historical data that suggests that incomes have been rising pretty steadily since 1750. Now, it's interesting. There was a period of time when incomes were pretty flat. In fact, from the year 500 or so to the year 1750, from the end of the Roman Empire to the beginning of what we now call the Industrial Revolution, per capita income actually remained constant or actually fell a bit. It wasn't until 1750 that Western society regained the high standard of living of the Roman Empire. So that was, what, 1,200 years of no growth of income. And then the Industrial Revolution occurred, and income started to rise. And it was slow at first, but cumulatively, per capita income probably increased, depending on the country, from 12 to 20-fold, from 1750 until maybe 1973. So we've had almost 200 years, 200 more or plus years of income growth in the Western world. But now things have flattened out. And you can see from this diagram that though incomes did grow after 1973, the rate of growth has come down remarkably. So whereas incomes grew by 100% from 1947 to 1973, it increased by only 38% from 1973 to 2001. And then from 2001 to 2007, it grew by actually less than 1%. And this is even before the start of the Great Recession. And then the Great Recession hit. The Great Recession hit officially in in December of 2007. The financial crisis and the Great Recession officially began in December 2007, and then officially ended in June of 2009. So it only lasted for about a year and a half. Over this period, real GDP fell by 4%, and then it actually gained 9% from 2009 to 2013. The unemployment rate shot up from 4.4% in May of 2007 to 10% in October of 2009, but it's now down to 7.4% in July of 2013. So officially the Great Recession ended, but did it end for the middle class? Well, no. No, in fact, from 2007 to 2011, median family income declined by 5%. 2011, median family income was back to where it was in 1996. So we've had 17 years without any growth in average family incomes. The latest figures from 2012, well, it shows no growth in income between 2011 to 2012. And the good news is that incomes have not fallen. The bad news is that they still haven't grown. So we've been in a pretty protracted period of income stagnation. Mean income has done better, but this reflects to a large extent incomes of the rich. So they weighted more heavily when you calculate the mean. Mean incomes started to diverge from the median, again, about 1973. You can see it growing much faster. It also came down since 2007, came down by about 4%. Poverty. Well, that's another rather sad story in this country. For a while, we've made great progress in reducing poverty in America. Between 1959 and 1973, the poverty rate was cut by more than half. The first year that it was officially measured in 1959, the poverty rate was 22%. By 1973, it had tumbled to 11.1%. So great progress was made in reducing poverty in this country. But after 1973, you can see that things have not changed very much. In fact, if anything, poverty has just gone up and down. It goes up during recessionary periods. It goes down during prosperity. By 2000, it had almost come back down to where it was in 1973. Still a little bit above, but almost down. And then you can see it moving upward, particularly during the Great Recession. So by 2011, it was back up to 15%. And the latest figures for 2012 show exactly the same poverty rate, 15%. So at least it hasn't risen more, but it certainly has not come down. What about the bottom 20% of families? So this is another way of looking at what's happened to the fortunes of the poor in this country. There's the poverty rate. This shows the share of the income of the bottom quintile. I started out by showing the share of the income of the top decile, but you can see from 1947 to 1973, the share of income of the bottom 20% was rising. Rose from about 3.5% to over 5%. But again, this year, 1973, 1974, things changed dramatically, and you can see this steep drop in the share of the bottom 20%, going from over 5% to about 3.5%. So it means that their share of income went down very dramatically. This is another way of looking at the fortunes of the poor in this country. This shows the actual income level, the mean income of the bottom 20% of families. Again, a lot of progress. 1947 to 1973. So this is, this measures the standard of living of the poorest segment of our society. So it doubled from 7,000 to more than doubled, from 7,000 to over 17,000. But then after 1973, 74, it really hasn't increased more. And in fact, during the Great Recession, it's fallen by almost 13%. So the poorest segment of our society, whereas median income went down by 5%, the income of this poorest 20% of our country has fallen by 12%. So they've done much worse than the average family. What's at the heart of this? Well, at the heart of this stagnation of incomes is really a story about wages. And wages in this country have been very stagnant. In fact, if we look at the most common measure of wages, this is the measure you see reported monthly in the newspaper. This is the mean hourly earnings from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. It's the series in brown. And actually, according to this series, mean hourly earnings peaked in 1973, actually peaked in 1973. And so we've had literally 40 years of no growth of wages in this country. In fact, they're still down from where they were in 1973. In contrast, from 1947 to 1973, real hourly earnings almost doubled. So again, we've seen a dramatic change in the fortunes of workers. There are a couple of other measures of earnings I present. Actually, one is based on national income accounts, wages and salaries per full-time employed worker. The one in red, I don't know why it didn't come out, is total worker compensation per full-time worker. But they show a very similar story. They show a very marked slowdown in growth after 1973. Inequality. Well, as I mentioned, we've been through a period of rising inequality. I started out by showing the share of the top 10%. This is based on what's called the Gini index. It's a measure that goes from 0 to 100. 0 being no inequality, 100 being the highest level of inequality. Again, you can see this dramatic change in our country. First, inequality falling from 1947 until some time in the late 1960s, early 1970s, and suddenly rather dramatically increasing thereafter, reaching its highest point ever by 2012, or in this case 2011. So we've had a marked turnaround of inequality in this country, with the Gini index reaching a peak level by 2011. This tells a very similar story. This is the share of the top 5% of families. Again, you can see this very steep decline from 1947. In this case, it seems to bottom out around 1980, 1981. And then a sharp rise after that. Very sharp rise, in fact, reaching almost its peak level in 2011. Taxes. Well, another important change has been with regard to tax rates in this country. We've had falling tax rates for both the rich and the middle class. I just show rates for the very rich. This is the top marginal tax rate. And for people about the 60th percentile and the 35th percentile. But let's concentrate, first of all, on the top graph. We had a country where federal tax rates were as high as 90%, actually 92%. During the 1950s and 1960s, our highest tax rate was 92%. And this often shocks people, but that was the way it was. And then there was a period when when the top marginal tax rate got lowered. 1966 went down to 70%. Kind of stayed there, went up during the Vietnam War and came back down to 70%. And then there were two famous tax cuts engineered by Ronald Reagan. First of all, the top marginal rate was reduced to 50% in 1981. And that was this year. And then 1986 was a famed Tax Reform Act of that year. And the top marginal rate came down to 28%. Stayed there for a while under George Bush Sr. 1991, it was raised to 31. And then Clinton raised it to 39.6% in 1993, where it remained until George W. Bush lowered it to 35%. But most recently, by 2013, it was back to 39.6% under Obama. But still, you can see a very steep decline in the tax rate faced by the richest families in our country. Tax rates at these other levels, after actually going up a bit, eventually have come down. But the point is that tax policy in this country has been much more favorable to the rich than to the middle class or to the poor. And of course that means that the rich can save a higher percentage of their income. They have more after-tax dollars, and that money can be invested, and they can buy stocks and bonds. That money invested in equities and bonds produce more income. So over time, this helps the rich a lot more than it does the middle class or the poor. Now, what's behind this tremendous shift in income distribution? Well, as I mentioned, wages have been flat for a long time, and this is despite the fact that productivity has been rising in this country. There was a time, again, during this early post-war period from 1947 to 1973, where wages and productivity increased at about the same rate. You can see the red line and the green line basically overlapping during this period. And then 1973, productivity growth slowed down. This was the productivity growth slowdown period. And wage growth also slowed down as well. But by 1979, 1980, productivity started to grow again in this country. And you can see it picking up, particularly during the 1980s, 1990s was a period of fairly rapid productivity growth. But wage growth did not. Wage growth did not. Wage growth flattened out, was very low, and productivity growth increased. Now, why is this a surprise? Well, for maybe 200, 250 years, wages and productivity have grown together, both in this country and throughout the world of industrial capitalism. But suddenly things have changed. And whereas productivity has resumed, wage growth has not. And, of course, this means what? Well, remember what Warren Buffett said. If wages haven't been rising, but output has been, then the difference must be going into higher profitability. And this is really what's behind almost everything, as I see it, that's going on. Stagnation of incomes, stagnation of wages, rising inequality, is that profitability has been increasing in this country. And I show two different graphs. The first is, at the top is what's called the profit share. So here we add together the profits of corporations plus property type income, dividends, interest, and this is what's called the profit share. And you can see that after going down from 1940s through, in this case, probably 1974 or so, the profit share has gone up in this country. The share of income going to profits has gone up, meaning the share of income going to workers has gone down. And by 2012, the profit share was at an all-time high in this country. The other graph shows the profit rate. This is the ratio of profits to the value of capital, and you can see a very similar pattern. After falling till about 1980, it's also started to increase. And in this case, by 2011, was close to its all-time high. So the story here is that whereas wages have been very flat, by some measures even down, profits and the profit share has increased. This shows the same trend for in corporate profits. So this is just looks at the share of corporate profits in national income. And again, you see this this fluctuates a lot over time, so it's not quite as clean as the other graphs. But you can see it falling from the late 40s, again, until about 1980. And then after a few dips, actually it came way down during the beginning of the Great Recession, 2007, 2008. Big drop in corporate profits. But corporate profits have recovered. Profits have recovered since the end of the Great Recession, and 2012 reached an all-time high. So the Great Recession, whereas it led to a stagnation in average family incomes, led to a decline in wages. Basically, the Great Recession hurt workers and working families. It was great for profits. Corporate profits have reached an all-time high. The share of overall profits in the economy has reached an all-time high. So there is definitely a real trade-off between what's happened to profits and what's happened to the average family in this country, what's happened to working families in particular. Warren Buffett was right. His class is definitely winning the war. Profits have resume their upward path. Now, some people think that, all we have to do is increase schooling in this country and all these problems will go away. And in fact, schooling has, at least according to traditional measures, has actually been doing pretty well, schooling attainment. And you can see median years of schooling increasing. Particularly if you think about the slowdown of incomes and earnings beginning in 1973. Well, schooling has actually been rising pretty steadily since 1973. Also, if we look at another measure, this is the share of share of adults with a high school degree and a college degree. You can see a pretty steady increase. High school degrees and college degrees in particular, the share of adults with a college degree even accelerated after 1973. So, the argument that how do we get wages rising again, how do we get family incomes increasing again, that the answer lies in education, well, that doesn't seem to be the case. We've actually been fairly successful in increasing educational levels in this country, but wages themselves have not really kept up with rising educational attainment. Oops, something happened. Okay. Well, okay, so that's basically the story I want to tell. It's a story of stagnating incomes, stagnating wages, but rising profits and rising profitability. Even through the booming 1990s and into the early 2000s, family incomes actually did not grow that much. We've seen personal tax rates falling, much more for the rich than for the middle class or for the poor. And the reason for this is the clear shift in national income away from labor and towards capital, particularly since the early 1980s. Over this period, both overall and corporate profitability has risen substantially, almost back to post-war highs. The stock market has in part been fueled by rising profitability, and whereas the rich, top 1%, even the top 1/10 of 1%, has gained from rising profits, workers have not experienced much progress in terms of wages. So on the surface, at least, there appears to be a trade-off between the advances in income and wealth made by the rich and the stagnation of income and wealth among the working class. In fact, you can show this using simple correlation coefficients, that the incomes of the middle class are negatively correlated with the rise of profitability. You can show that the rising profitability and the income inequality, particularly as measured by the share of income of the top 1 or 5%, are pretty highly correlated. And so it appears that what's behind rising profitability, what's behind rising income inequality and stagnating incomes is in fact the shift of national income away from labor and towards owners of business. So, what do we do? What can we do about this? Well, You know, education, while it's good and we should promote more education, will not, I believe, reverse these two trends. And what we really have to do is rethink the social contract between labor and business owners. During the golden age of American capitalism from 1947 to 1973 or so, unions were strong, and there was actually an implicit social contract between business and labor, and productivity gains were equally shared between the two. And as a result, wages increased substantially. But the mid and late 1970s saw a profit squeeze. We saw profitability declining over these years. Let's see if I can backtrack a bit. Yeah, you can see profitability going down, particularly from the 1950s through the mid-1970s. And these years also saw the birth of neoliberalism and a switch in corporate philosophy from stakeholder value, whereby the different clientele of the firm, shareholders, clients, customers, and workers were each accorded benefits from the firm, to shareholder value, wherein maximizing stock prices became the sole aim of the firm. And this is well documented in the book by William Lazonick. He calls the first phase the old economic business model, a period when workers were treated as members of the family by the firm, where wages were good, benefits were good, where workers were trained, and where and this was the period of stakeholder value. And then sometime in the mid to late 1970s, this whole paradigm switched from one of stakeholder value to one of shareholder value, what Lazonick calls the new economic business model, where workers were treated as just one input into the production process, disposable input, where benefits were cut, where workers were no longer treated as part of the family. And this is really the beginning of the wage stagnation and the middle class squeeze. And so since 1980 or so, wages have generally risen with inflation, but certainly not in real terms. So what this country really needs is a shift in norms back to where we used to be, back to the old economic business model. Certainly unions have declined in this country, shriveled in fact. The most recent statistics show that only 8% of workers in the private sector belong to unions. And certainly unionization, when you look at the cross-national evidence, is a key factor explaining wage growth versus wage stagnation in countries like the United States. So as I see it, really the solution lies in the return of the social contract, going back to a period when shareholder value is the new norm, and where stakeholder value becomes the norm again, where the emphasis on maximizing profits is no longer the case. So, in any case, that's my view of what's happened. So thank you very much.
Please step up to the microphones. Professor Wolff will be happy to respond to some questions.
Really appreciated your discussion. A question that I had was the effect of globalization along your timeline there, and possibly the outflow of maybe skilled jobs from the U.S. Is that a piece of the picture?
Yes, yes, that certainly is. I kind of skimped on going through the laundry list of causes of rising inequality. I see the main cause as being the breakdown of the social contract between workers and business owners, but there are other factors involved, one of which is globalization. In fact, I showed a slide earlier in today to some students in Lloyd Thomas's class, showing that beginning exactly about the same time, 1973, was a sharp rise in international trade in the United States. 1973 marked the end of what was called the Bretton Woods system of fixed exchange rates and the beginning of flexible exchange rates. And this opened up trade in the United States, and we saw a big increase in the both exports, but particularly imports into the United States. And of course, if you import goods from less developed countries, low-wage countries. Back then, it was mainly Mexico and Latin America, and then it shifted to China in the 80s and 90s. Today, it's more likely to be countries like Bangladesh and Vietnam. That effectively expands the supply of low-skilled workers. And so what that means is that as the relative supply of low-skilled workers rises, their relative wage falls. And that certainly was a principal factor explaining, was another factor explaining rising inequality and wage stagnation as well. Also, as American companies started to invest abroad, that's the other side of globalization. It's not just importing goods, but it's also building businesses, moving businesses from the United States, particularly in manufacturing, to these low-wage countries. That also effectively expands the supply of low-skilled workers. And that was another reason why wages started to stagnate around this time and inequality started to rise.
If I may have a second question that I just thought of as you mentioned that. I've heard that our trade policies in the international marketplace are such that countries with a value-added tax actually refund that tax to the exporters. In other words, the goods coming out of a lot of the trading countries aren't burdened with a tax, whereas in the U.S. system, the income tax that the corporations bear is reflected in their product, so that you actually have unburdened foreign goods, unburdened by taxes, competing against American goods that carry a tax burden. Is that, am I correct in saying that?
I think you're going a little bit beyond my area of expertise, but I think you're right. And
Well, I heard that this was negotiated back at the early part of your timeline, when nobody could conceive of the fact that this would make a major difference. But if you think about that tax increment, that essentially Chinese goods can sell cheaper in the U.S. than they do in China because they're untaxed, except for the part of the supply line that ends up in the U.S.
Yeah, no, I think that's a very interesting point, and that would...
And I guess in general, my question is, it seems like we have a shrinking pie that we're worried about it being maybe not the inequity that's developing in this shrinking pie. And I guess, we should look for policies that'll increase the size of this pie and the manufacturing jobs.
Well, productivity is rising. If you look at the green line, that's our productivity. So after a slight blip during the Great Recession, it's actually resumed. So actually, our economic pie is growing. It is growing, and it's had pretty steady growth for what's this, 65 years.
But now, that includes the investment in equipment also, correct?
Yeah, the
I'm not
GDP
an
includes
economist.
investment and government spending and a whole bunch of...
So, in a way, does that reflect robots replacing labor, or?
Well, yeah, part of the reason productivity has grown, particularly in manufacturing, is due to automation. Manufacturing output is not doing so badly in this country. What's happening, of course, is because of automation and high productivity growth, manufacturing jobs have been shrinking, but manufacturing output has continued to grow. So, but that by itself should not lead to rising inequality or declining wages. Historically, average wages have followed average productivity in this country. And not only this country, but many countries around the world, and not just for this short period of time, but for 100 years.
Okay.
And that's the reason why...
Yeah, I'm sorry, I didn't.
That's fine. You actually kind of answered my question about the significance of 1973 just with that question, but was there another trend or a significant event that happened in 1973 besides globalization and investment in the world market?
Yeah, it was actually sort of a confluence of several important trends. We've had start of globalization. We had the oil shocks. That was the first of 2 years when OPEC, which back then was a fairly effective monopoly controlling oil supplies, decided to cut back on oil. And as a result, the oil prices went up by a factor of 4 around the world. And so that was another crucial event that happened in 1973. It was quite a shock, particularly to the American economy, and a lot of firms had to readjust their production. You can see productivity dipping just about this time. 1973, it's hard to make out exactly when. You see the green line actually goes down. That was the period of productivity slowdown in the United States. And productivity actually stagnated for about 6 years, 1973 to 1979, partly as a consequence of the oil crisis. It was also a year when, well, that we kind of date the beginning of the information technology revolution. It's the year when some economic historians call it the beginning of the third industrial revolution in the United States. We had electrification in the 1880s, which created a whole new set of technologies. We had the automotive second industrial revolution revolving around automobiles in the 1920s. And some people call information technology the third industrial revolution because it started to and continues to radically alter the workplace. You know, the evidence suggests that the information technology revolution, automation, computerization has radically changed the job structure in this country, particularly by hollowing out the middle of the skills distribution. A lot of mid-level skill jobs. You can think of secretaries, a lot of blue-collar production type jobs were eliminated through automation. So this is another you know, important event that dates to 1973.
Thanks.
Hi. I would like to start off by saying you're a very respectable man with many hours of education and research behind you. I also respect your opinion, but
Sounds like a leading question.
I also understand your opinion, but I don't necessarily agree with it.
Yeah.
So the scenario that comes to my mind is two kids. They both have the same education opportunities. You're talking about equality, so same education opportunities, same economic, same economic situation, and basically the same variables. The only difference is they choose different paths and different actions to take. So one decides to drink, one decides to use substances for bad things, and the other studies very hard in high school and college, and they both come out and get into the world. And I have three questions here relating to that, and the first one is, why should they have the same income? How is it justified? And how does it give incentive to work harder in school and in education if we come out with the same income? Thank you.
Okay, yeah, no, those are really excellent questions. And, you know, that's why there's not uniform opinion that we should have perfect equality, either in terms of income or in terms of any kind of economic outcome. I think most people would agree, and maybe you would agree, that what we should guarantee is equal economic opportunity, that people should be given a level playing field, they should be given similar resources, and then, you know, if person A wants to work harder, wants to study harder, even if he or she has more talent, then that person should be rewarded with higher wages. Yeah, I mean, I don't disagree with that, but I think it doesn't really explain why sort of the overall inequality has been rising over time. It's not as if we suddenly have a situation where, or at least I don't believe, where there's become a greater variation in the amount of effort different people put in. It's like suddenly today, you know, you work a lot harder and other people of your age group work a lot less hard than was the case 40 years ago. So I don't think this differential, whereas I agree that people who work harder, put in more effort, who are more capable should get higher earnings. I agree with that. I don't think there's been a greater divergence in effort or talent among people that would account for, the rise, this very sharp rise of inequality, take the top 5%, that we see. I think something else is going on, that, people with top talents are rewarded much greater relative to people with less talents. I think that's, that's what's going on, not that people, not that there's a more unequal distribution of effort or ability. So, I think something else is going on, that the system is rewarding people at the top much greater relative to people at the bottom than they used to, than the system used to 40 or 60 years ago. It's like, we talked about this in class today, that, 60 years ago we had Joe DiMaggio, one of the greatest baseball players of all time. 80 years ago we had Babe Ruth. These, by any standard, they were, outstanding relative to other baseball players, as Alex Rodriguez is today relative to other baseball players today. But the change has been that now Alex Rodriguez is, gets, I don't know, perhaps 30 times as much as the average worker, whereas Babe Ruth got maybe 5 times as much as the average worker. So the whole reward system has changed. Not that people are, that we don't have differential in ability, it's just that the rewards for the people at the high end have increased. What was the statistic you gave? The average CEO now makes 400 times as, times as much as the average worker. And 30, 40 years ago, it was a ratio of 40. It's not that CEOs are so much more capable today or that they work so much harder relative to the average worker. It's just that the rewards for this, for this high effort has, magnified manyfold. So I think that's the issue. It's not that that we want to pay everyone the same, irrespective of their ability or their effort. It's just that the differential in rewards has increased so dramatically.
Thank you.
I was just curious, you talked about the union membership has decreased. I think you said 8% at one point is the union membership in the United States today. Is there a way to encourage people to rejoin the unions, or is that the only way to slightly close the gap between wages and profits at all? Or is there a social solution to that, or is there a legislative solution to that you would see?
Well, I think it's both a question of unionization, but also it's a political economy issue. I think there's been a real shift in the role of the government favoring business over labor, and one can kind of date it to 1982 when there was a very famous strike of air controllers in this country, the so-called PATCO union. Air controllers, that's a federal job, and there was a law prohibiting federal workers, or at least air controllers, from going on strike. Well, they went on strike. But this often happens in the public sector, even though there are laws against it. I remember in New York City, I don't know, 7 or 8 years ago, there were laws prohibiting transit workers from going on strike. Nonetheless, the transit workers in New York City went on strike, shutting down the subway system for several days. Everyone was very unhappy. But it's not that anything happened to these transit workers. But Reagan instead fired all the air controllers. This was a very radical act. Legally, he was justified, I guess, but this was a real political statement. And I think from that moment onward, and there were other factors as well, the state, which used to be a pretty fair arbitrator between labor and business, really switched allegiance to the business sector. And that change in political economy has actually been maintained even through the Democratic administrations, Clinton and even Obama today. So I think the message has to come down on the political level that the interests of labor will be not only maintained but advanced. And the unionization process in this country is very difficult. We have by far the toughest labor laws of any of the advanced industrial countries. It's much harder to form a union in this country than it is in, say, France or Germany or even Canada. And so thus the labor law has to be reformed. Every time there's an attempt to do that, it gets defeated in Congress. Part of the one effect of high inequality is that we kind of lose our democracy. We get businesses basically running the government, and they do this because they contribute more money to campaigns. They do this because of lobbying, so that businesses have a much greater impact, much greater influence over the government than labor does. So it becomes self-reinforced. So it's going to be very hard to reignite the union movement and to get Washington to start to side with labor and push their interests.
Thank you.
Hi. You mentioned that some other countries are ahead of us as far as some of these things. You mentioned Finland, Sweden, and Canada. I know you didn't bring up any sources or any graphs or anything like that to back that up, but I was just wondering if you could maybe break down why they have just a better wage and income and tax balance than we do, or essentially what are they doing that we're not in the U.S.?
Well, the main thing they're doing is having a much more extensive social welfare state, income transfer system. I was talking about unemployment, our unemployment insurance system earlier. We only cover people who lose their job, who have worked a minimum typically of 6 months, who have a certain minimum earnings. We only cover about a third to 40% of our unemployed workers through our unemployment system. Other countries actually cover 80 or 90% of unemployed workers. A country like Netherlands, for example, will cover people who just graduate from college if they don't have a job. They're immediately covered by unemployment insurance. We don't cover them because they don't have the minimum work requirement to qualify. So there are a whole host of income support systems and social transfer systems that exist in these other countries that we just don't have, or we have to a much lesser extent. Again, unemployment insurance, some European countries, replacement rates are up to 70 or 80%. That means 70 or 80% of the previous wage is covered by the unemployment benefit. Our replacement rate is 35%. So much greater income supports from these other countries. Much more progressive tax systems. If you look at our whole tax system, I just showed the federal income tax. But we also have regressive taxes. Social Security tax is actually somewhat regressive because it has a wage cap. Sales taxes are quite regressive. So when you look at our overall tax system, it turns out to be fairly neutral with respect to redistribution. So other countries have overall, much more progressive tax systems. So that's another factor that explains their greater equality.
Would you say like that redistribution would be more the answer, or that just? I mean, I understand that higher taxes is also a part of that, but would you say more that raising the minimum wage would be more of an answer rather than redistribution?
Yeah, I think we have to raise the minimum wage. That peaked in 1968. But if you just see if I can do this quickly. Yeah, look at this diagram, share of the top 5%, and look at what's happened to the tax rates. Share of the top 5% goes up. The tax rates on the rich go down. So there is a fairly close correspondence between the degree of progressivity of the tax system. This means that it's much less progressive, 2013 than it was certainly in 1955, let's say, and rising inequality. So there is a pretty clear correspondence between those two things.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Let's thank Professor Wolff for
announcing.